There are encounters that mark our souls forever. Moments when two lives cross paths in the most unexpected places, creating bonds that neither time nor distance can break. This is the story of a man hardened by the lonely roads of the American West, and a boy whose light burned brightly though only for a short while. A story that teaches us the true value of a life isn't measured in years lived, but in the love shared and the marks we leave on the hearts of others. In the vast plains of Wyoming, where dust and wind write stories across the arid land, a drama unfolded that forever transformed those who lived it. We invite you to stay until the end of this moving story, to reflect on the small gestures that change destinies, and to share your own experiences in the comments. Because all of us, at some point in our lives, have been both the lonely traveler and the child waiting by the road. In the year 1978, the dusty roads connecting the towns of the American interior were still traveled by cattlemen who drove livestock from one region to another. They were men toughened by the unforgiving sun, accustomed to sleeping under the stars and facing the challenges of keeping hundreds of animals together during weeks of travel. Among these cattlemen was one who stood out for his experience and reserved character. His name was Jake Morrison. He was 45 years old, but the deep wrinkles around his eyes and prematurely gray hair made him look older. He was a man of strong build, enormous hands marked by decades of hard work, and eyes the color of dry earth that had seen too much in his endless journeys. He always wore a red bandana around his neck that had belonged to his late wife, and rode a paint horse named Thunder who had been with him for 15 years. His entire life fit in worn leather saddlebags, spare clothes, basic tools, and an instrument that never left him, a brass horn he used to direct the cattle and announce his arrival. Jake had been born into this wandering life. His father had been a cattleman before him, teaching him the trade since he was small. But unlike his father, who had a family waiting in some town, Jake had no fixed home. His wife had died of tuberculosis 8 years earlier, leaving him alone and childless. Since then, the roads were all he knew and all he needed. Or so he believed. The route between Sheridan and Gillette was one he traveled most frequently. 120 miles of difficult terrain, crossing arid zones where water was scarce and summer heat could kill men and animals alike. But it was a profitable route, because the ranchers of Gillette paid well for quality cattle that came from the south. Approximately halfway along the route, where the road crossed the ranch of old man Frank Wilson, there was a wooden gate. It was a simple gate, painted white but peeling from time, with a sign that read Wilson's Hope Ranch. There was nothing special about it. It was like dozens of other gates on those rural routes. But that gate would become the most important place in Jake Morrison's life, because of the boy who watched over it. The first time Jake saw Tommy was during a trip in early summer. He was bringing a herd of almost 300 head of young cattle, a big job he'd accepted from the Patterson brothers, prosperous ranchers from Sheridan. The cattle were nervous, animals that had never made a long journey. Keeping them together required constant vigilance. It was mid-afternoon when they approached the gate. The heat was stifling and Jake was exhausted, covered in red dust that stuck to the sweat on his face. As he mentally prepared to dismount from Thunder and open the gate, he saw something that surprised him. A boy came running from a small cabin located about 50 yards from the road. He couldn't have been more than 8 years old, thin as a reed, with black disheveled hair, bare feet, dressed in patched pants and an oversized shirt. But what most caught Jake's attention was his smile. An enormous smile that lit up his brown face. The boy reached the gate before the herd and began opening it with quick, efficient movements that spoke of practice. Within minutes, he had completely cleared the path. He stepped aside but didn't leave. He stayed there, watching with eyes bright with excitement, waiting. Jake stopped Thunder next to the boy. "Thanks, son," he said with his rough, raspy voice. The boy didn't respond immediately. He seemed to be gathering courage. When all the cattle had passed, he finally spoke with a voice clear but shy. "Mr. Cattleman, could you play the horn? Please. I really love hearing it." Jake was surprised. It had been years since anyone had asked him to play the horn for pleasure, only out of work necessity. He looked into those pleading eyes, that expression of pure hope, and felt something move in his hardened chest. He took the horn from his belt and brought it to his lips. The sound emerged deep and melancholic, traveling through the hot air, bouncing off distant hills. It was a sound that spoke of far horizons, of freedom, of the romantic solitude of endless roads. The boy's eyes lit up as if stars had been kindled in them. He applauded with genuine enthusiasm, jumping with joy. How beautiful! How beautiful it sounds! Thank you, sir, thank you so much. Jake, not quite knowing why, pulled a coin from his pocket. It wasn't much, but he handed it to the boy. The boy received it with reverent care, as if it were an invaluable treasure. Thank you, sir. May God watch over you on your journey. May you arrive safely wherever you're going. Those words, spoken with such sincerity by this small boy, touched something in Jake that had been asleep for years. He nodded, adjusted his red bandana, and continued on his way. But as he rode away, he realized he was smiling, something he hadn't done in a very long time. He didn't know then that this encounter would change his life forever. The boy's name was Tommy. Tommy Edward Reed. He had just turned 8 years old and lived with his mother, Sarah, in that modest cabin by the road. His father had died 4 years earlier in an accident while working to repair a windmill. A gust of wind had toppled the structure, crushing him, leaving Sarah widowed with a small child and no means of support. Sarah was a 34-year-old woman, small but strong, with working hands and a heart full of love for her son. After her husband's death, she had to find ways to survive. She washed clothes for families in the nearby town. She sewed when there was work. She cultivated a small garden behind the cabin. She raised chickens. It wasn't much, but it was enough so that she and Tommy didn't starve. The cabin belonged to Frank Wilson, owner of the large ranch through which the road passed. Frank was a stern but fair man. When Sarah's husband died, he had allowed her to stay in that abandoned cabin in exchange for Tommy opening the gate for cattlemen who passed through. It was a simple arrangement that gave Sarah and her son a roof over their heads. For Tommy, opening the gate wasn't work but an adventure. He loved watching the cattlemen pass with their herds. He loved the horses, the smell of earth and animals, the sound of hooves against the ground. But more than anything, he loved the sound of the horn. There was something about that deep sound that touched his soul, that spoke to him of worlds larger than the small space of his existence. The route between Sheridan and Gillette was one Jake traveled approximately every month, sometimes every 6 weeks, depending on jobs. And each time he passed that gate, there was Tommy waiting. No matter the time of day, whether it was hot or threatening rain, the boy always appeared when he heard the distant sound of the herd approaching. A routine developed between them. Tommy would open the gate, the cattle would pass, Jake would play the horn, give the boy a small coin, and then they'd talk for a few minutes. They were simple conversations, the kind an adult man has with a child, but for both they meant much more. Jake told him about the places he'd seen, towns with old churches, rushing rivers he'd crossed, terrible storms he'd faced. Tommy listened with wide eyes, absorbing every word. His world was small, limited to that cabin and the nearby town he occasionally visited with his mother. Jake's stories opened windows to worlds he'd never imagined. Tommy, for his part, told him about his daily life with charming innocence. He talked about his chickens, his skinny dog named Shadow, the garden where he helped his mother. He told of his dreams of someday being a cattleman like Jake, of traveling those roads, of seeing all those wonderful places. For Jake, these encounters with Tommy became something he looked forward to with genuine anticipation. In his solitary and monotonous life, the boy represented something pure, something good. He saw in Tommy something of himself as a child, before life had hardened him. The men who occasionally worked with Jake noticed he was different. He smiled more. He was less gruff. He seemed to have a lightness he hadn't had before. Sarah observed these encounters from a distance with mixed feelings. On one hand, she was grateful that her son had this small joy. On the other hand, she worried Tommy would become too attached to someone whose life was the road, someone who could disappear at any moment. But she didn't have the heart to deny her son that happiness. Months passed. The friendship between Jake and Tommy deepened. Jake began bringing small gifts for the boy, a small knife, a new rope, once an old hat that Tommy received as the greatest treasure in the world. Tommy waited for Jake's visits with an anticipation that brightened his days. It was during one of these encounters when Tommy asked Jake a question that marked him deeply. "Mr. Jake, The boy said, looking at him with serious eyes. "Are you happy being a cattleman? Don't you feel lonely on the roads?" Jake remained silent for a long moment. He looked at the horizon, thinking about his answer. "Loneliness is part of the job, Tommy. You get used to it. The roads become your home. Happy? I don't know if I've thought much about happiness. But lately," and here he looked at the boy with something like a smile, "lately I've discovered there are things that make the road less heavy. Like a boy who waits to hear the horn and reminds me there's goodness in the world." Tommy didn't understand completely, but he understood enough to know that somehow he mattered to this man. And that made him feel special, valued. It was in the spring of the following year when everything changed. Jake had accepted an especially difficult and well-paid job, transporting a herd of wild cattle from the corrals near Sheridan to the markets in Gillette. They were animals that had never been fully domesticated. Nervous, unpredictable, always seeking to escape. It was dangerous cattle that required constant vigilance. Jake had hired 4 experienced hands to help him, men who knew how to handle difficult animals. But even so, he knew this journey would be a challenge. The pay was double the normal rate. Jake was thinking about retiring soon, maybe buying a small piece of land. This job would bring him closer to that dream. They left Sheridan on a cold spring morning. There were approximately 200 animals, all nervous from the start. They stampeded at anything: a bird flying too close, a strange shadow, an unexpected noise. The hands worked tirelessly to keep them together. The journey was problematic from the beginning. One of the largest bulls tried to escape several times. It was an enormous animal with sharp horns and crazed eyes. Each escape attempt made the entire herd nervous. When they finally arrived near the gate at Wilson's Hope Ranch, it was late afternoon and everyone was exhausted. From a distance, Jake saw Tommy's familiar figure running toward the gate. Despite his exhaustion, he felt a warmth in his chest. He played the horn, sending the deep sound through the air. He watched as Tommy stopped when he heard it. How he looked toward where the sound came from with that expression of joy Jake knew so well. Tommy reached the gate and began opening it with his usual efficiency. He was so focused he didn't immediately notice how different this herd was, how nervous the animals were. Jake shouted from the distance, "Tommy, get away from the road. This cattle's dangerous. Stay back." The boy heard him and nodded, but stayed near the edge of the road as he always did, wanting to watch the animals pass. The herd was approaching. Jake could feel the tension in the air. He shouted orders to his hands, trying to keep everything under control. And then it happened. Just as the first cattle were beginning to pass, the large bull that had caused problems all day got spooked by something. It bellowed loudly and lunged to the side, directly toward where Tommy was standing. Everything happened in seconds that seemed eternal. Jake saw the bull heading toward the boy. He saw Tommy's eyes when he understood the danger. He saw the boy try to run but stumble. He watched with absolute horror as the bull lowered its head and charged at the small body that had fallen. Jake screamed, a desperate scream that came from the deepest part of his being. He spurred thunder trying to get there, but he was too far away. The bull struck Tommy, lifting him in the air as if he weighed nothing. The boy's body flew several yards before falling heavily onto the hard earth. Jake dismounted before thunder had stopped and ran to where the boy lay. What he saw froze his blood. Tommy was lying motionless, with blood on his head and chest, his shirt torn and stained red. Jake knelt beside him, his hands trembling. He put his ear to the boy's chest and heard, weak but present, the beating of his heart. He was alive but barely. "Tommy, look at me. Open your eyes," Jake shouted, his voice breaking. But the boy didn't respond. Sarah came running from the cabin. When she saw her son on the ground covered in blood, she let out a scream that would have broken the hardest heart. She threw herself to the ground next to Tommy, taking his hand, crying, pleading to God. Jake, acting on pure instinct, carefully lifted the boy in his arms. He was so light, so fragile. He lifted him onto Thunder and mounted behind him, holding him against his chest. He shouted to Sarah to climb up too. They had to get him to town, to the doctor, quickly. Jake spurred Thunder like never before. They covered the 4 miles to town in record time, but every second was an eternity. He felt Tommy's weak breathing against his chest. He felt the warmth of his blood. And he prayed, something he hadn't done in years, begging them to save this boy. They arrived in town as the sun was setting. Jake went straight to the house of Dr. Henry Carter, the town's only physician. He brought Tommy down and pounded on the door desperately. The doctor opened, and seeing the bloodied boy, immediately brought them inside. What followed were hours of anguish. Dr. Carter worked on Tommy while Jake and Sarah waited outside. Jake paced back and forth, unable to stay still. He was covered with the boy's blood, his face marked by deep lines of worry. Sarah cried silently, her hands joined in constant prayer. Finally, after what seemed like years, the doctor came out. His serious face said more than words. "I've done everything I can. The boy has broken ribs, severe internal damage, serious head trauma. He's lost a lot of blood. I've stabilized him, but he needs care I can't provide here. He needs a hospital. And even then, I can't promise you anything. It's very serious." Sarah collapsed. Jake stood petrified, feeling the world crumbling. "Can I see him?" he asked in a hoarse voice. The doctor nodded. Jake entered the room where they'd put Tommy. The boy was lying down, bandaged, pale as death. He looked even smaller like this. Fragile, vulnerable. Jake approached and took the small hand in his large, calloused one. It was cold. "Forgive me, Tommy," he whispered, tears finally running down his weathered face. "I should have protected you. This is my fault." The following days were a nightmare. Tommy sometimes seemed to improve, other times worsened. Fever rose. His breathing became labored. The doctor did everything he could with limited resources. Jake stayed in town, abandoning his work, abandoning the cattle. He told his hands to sell the animals, to do what was necessary. He couldn't leave while Tommy needed him. He spent his days helping Sarah however he could. He brought her food she barely touched. He took care of practical tasks she couldn't do. It was his way of expiating the guilt that gnawed at him. A week after the accident, Tommy had a severe crisis. His fever rose dangerously and he began convulsing. The doctor worked frantically to stabilize him. They were terrible hours when it seemed the boy would finally succumb. But with mysterious determination, Tommy fought. When dawn arrived, the crisis had passed. From that day, slowly, Tommy began to improve. 2 weeks after the accident, the doctor finally allowed him to return home. Sarah cared for him with absolute devotion. Jake also stayed, helping with everything. He had completely abandoned his life as a cattleman. A month after Tommy returned home, Dr. Carter visited the cabin with news. His serious face warned they weren't good. "Tommy's going to survive," he said, "but there's something you need to know. The internal damage is permanent. He'll live, but his life won't be the same. He'll probably never fully recover his strength. He'll have chronic pain. And," he paused searching for the right words, "the damage to his organs is extensive. Over time, that damage will take its toll. He may have some years, maybe many if he's lucky, but I want you to be prepared. His life will be shorter than it should be." The silence that followed was heavy. Tommy was going to survive, but at what cost? He would never be the boy he had been. His time in this world was now marked by a premature expiration date. Sarah took the news with the resignation of someone who had already suffered too much. "Then we'll treasure every day God gives us with him," she said simply. Jake said nothing. The guilt he'd felt multiplied 1,000-fold. Because of his work, because of his wild cattle, this boy would now have a life marked by suffering and shortened by irreparable damage. Days passed. Tommy continued improving slowly. Jake had completely abandoned his life as a cattleman. He'd lost all the money saved for his retirement, but that didn't matter. He stayed helping Sarah and Tommy, transforming into something like a member of the family. Tommy, despite the pain he clearly felt, showed incredible spirit. He never complained. He smiled when he could, and frequently asked when he could return to the gate, when he could hear the horn again. A month after returning home, when Tommy could sit outside, Jake took his horn. He stood before the boy and brought it to his lips. The sound emerged deep and melancholic, filling the space. Tommy's eyes lit up with the same joy as always. For a moment, it was as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. And both knew it. Months passed. Tommy slowly recovered some mobility, but never returned to being the active boy he'd been. He walked with difficulty, tired easily, had bad days when the pain was intense. But his spirit remained intact. Jake stayed. He didn't return to the roads. He'd transformed into the father Tommy had never known. The town people began talking about the relationship between Jake and Sarah, but the truth was more complex. There was no romance. What existed was guilt and forgiveness, shared pain, the bond formed between people who've gone through terrible trauma together. And at the center of everything was Tommy. The boy was the reason Jake kept going, the reason he found strength each day. Tommy was also the reason Sarah smiled, why she didn't surrender to sadness. A year passed. Then another. Tommy turned 9 years old, then 10. He grew, but slowly, more slowly than normal. He remained small for his age, thin, fragile. But his mind was sharp and his heart generous. He learned to read and write with Sarah and Jake's help. He devoured any book he could get, especially those that spoke of distant places and adventures. Jake, who had spent his entire life on the roads, found a strange peace in this more sedentary existence. He missed the journey sometimes, but when he looked at Tommy, when he saw the boy's smile, he knew he was exactly where he needed to be. The gate remained there. Other cattlemen passed. Other herds crossed the property. Tommy could no longer run to open it as he used to, but he sat in his chair by the road when he heard a herd approaching. He watched the animals pass with the same fascination as always. And sometimes, if the cattleman was kind, they'd play the horn for him. Tommy always smiled when he heard that sound. He'd close his eyes and seemed transported to another place. For Jake, those moments were bittersweet. Each time he saw a herd, he relived that terrible day of the accident. He saw Tommy falling, saw the blood, heard the screams. It was a trauma he would never completely overcome. That's why he'd put away his own horn. He'd wrapped it carefully and stored it in a chest. He couldn't play it without reliving that day. "Someday you'll play it again," Tommy occasionally told him. "I like when other cattlemen play their horns, but yours was the most beautiful of all." Jake only nodded silently, unable to explain to the boy why that sound now caused him so much pain. During the 3rd year after the accident, Tommy began noticeably worsening. The pain became more frequent and intense. His energy diminished even more. Dr. Carter, after examining him, gave them the news they'd been dreading. The internal damage is progressing. The damaged organs are beginning to fail. Maybe months, maybe a year. "I'm very sorry." Sarah received the news with a calm that can only come from having always known this day would arrive. That night, when Tommy was sleeping, she cried like never before. Jake found her on the porch and let her cry on his shoulder. "It's not fair," Sarah said between sobs. "He's just a boy. He already lost his father, already suffered so much. Why does he have to leave?" Jake had no answers. He could only be there, share the pain. The following months were bittersweet. Knowing time was limited, Sarah and Jake dedicated themselves to making each day special for Tommy. They cooked his favorite meals. They read his preferred stories. They took him on small outings when he felt well. Jake told him stories of his days as a cattleman, stories he'd lived and also some he invented, designed to make Tommy's eyes shine with wonder. He spoke of places he'd supposedly seen, of adventures he'd supposedly had. And Tommy listened with the same fascination as always. If you haven't seen our channel, we invite you to subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss our stories. Give it a like if this story is moving you. Share it with someone who needs to remember the value of each moment. And leave us in the comments. Have you ever had a brief encounter that changed your life forever? Your story could inspire others. One afternoon, while sitting with Jake watching the sunset, Tommy said something Jake would never forget. "Mr. Jake, when I'm gone, will you still take care of my mom? She's going to be very lonely. And you too. Maybe you could take care of each other." Jake had to walk away for a moment so the boy wouldn't see him cry. When he could control his emotions, he returned and promised Tommy he would always care for Sarah. Tommy, for his part, seemed to have an understanding beyond his years about what was happening to him. He never directly asked if he was dying, but sometimes said things that showed he knew that he understood. "You know something, Mr. Jake," he told him one morning, "I'm not afraid. I've had a good life. I had my mom who loved me more than anything. And I had you, who was like a father to me. Not everyone can say that." The end came one autumn afternoon, when leaves were beginning to fall and the air had that cool touch. Tommy had spent a bad night with much pain. When morning came, he seemed calmer, as if he'd finally found peace. He asked to be taken outside to his place by the road, where he'd sat so many times watching herds pass. Sarah and Jake carried him carefully, sat him with pillows, covered him with a blanket. The day was beautiful, with a clear blue sky and the sun shining softly. The three of them stayed there in silence, enjoying the day, being together. And then, in the distance, they heard something. It was the sound of a horn. There was a herd approaching on the road. Tommy opened his eyes that had been half closed. A small smile appeared on his pale face. "The horn," he murmured. "I still love hearing it." The herd passed. It was a small group led by a young cattleman Tommy didn't know. The cattleman saw the boy sitting there and, without anyone asking him, took out his horn and played it. The deep and melancholic sound filled the air. Tommy closed his eyes and smiled more broadly. His lips moved, murmuring something Sarah and Jake had to lean in to hear. "It's beautiful. It's always been so beautiful." And then, with that smile still on his face, with the sound of the horn still resonating in the air, Tommy exhaled softly and was gone. There was no struggle, no apparent pain. He simply left, as if he could finally rest, as if he'd been waiting to hear that sound one last time before departing. Sarah screamed, a scream that came from the deepest part of her soul. She clung to her son's body, rocking him, calling him, refusing to accept what had just happened. Jake stood frozen, feeling as if his heart had been ripped from his chest. The funeral was 2 days later. They buried Tommy in the small-town cemetery, under a large tree where birds sang every morning. Sarah insisted on putting on his headstone, "Tommy Reed, the boy who loved the sound of the horn. Rest in peace, little angel." On the road, right where the accident had occurred 3 years earlier, Jake built a cross. It was simple, made of wood, but he made it with care and love. He painted it white so it could be seen from a distance. And beside it he planted flowers he would care for as long as he lived. After the funeral, Jake had to make decisions about his life. The roads called to him. He'd received job offers. He could return to his previous life. But when he thought about that, when he thought about passing through that stretch of road where the cross stood, he knew he couldn't. He couldn't bear the idea of passing there driving cattle again. He made a decision that surprised many but felt right. He would stay. He would stay in that small town, in that cabin by the road. He'd made a promise to Tommy to care for Sarah. He intended to keep it. And he made a vow standing by Tommy's grave. He swore he would never play the horn again. That sound Tommy had loved so much, that sound that had been the bond between them, was now too sacred, too painful. It had been the last thing Tommy had heard before dying. "Never again," he whispered by the grave. "On this piece of road where I lost what I loved most, never again will I sound the horn. This is my way of honoring your memory." He stored his horn in a chest. He wrapped it carefully in cloth. It was the last physical link to the happy days with Tommy. He would never sell it, never get rid of it, but neither would he play it again. It was his penance, his way of carrying the guilt that still consumed him. Life continued as it always does after tragedies. Jake adapted to his new existence. He got work at the town's general store. It didn't pay much, but it was enough. He also helped at the cabin, keeping things in order, caring for the garden, repairing what broke. He'd become a constant figure in Sarah's life. Sarah, for her part, found ways to keep going. The pain never completely disappeared, but she learned to live with it. She continued washing clothes, continued sewing, continued caring for her garden and her chickens. Life had to continue. The two found comfort in talking about Tommy. They spent afternoons sitting on the porch, sharing memories of the boy. Sarah told stories of when Tommy was a baby. Jake told about all their encounters at the gate. It was their way of keeping Tommy's memory alive. The gate remained there. Cattlemen continued passing with their herds. But there was no longer a boy running to open it. Now it was Jake who opened the gate when necessary, a job he did with heaviness in his heart. Each time he did it, he remembered Tommy running with such energy. Each time he heard the sound of animals passing, he remembered the accident. Many cattlemen who passed regularly noticed the change. They noticed the cross on the road. They noticed there was no longer a cheerful boy. Some asked what had happened, and when they found out, they were saddened. Some began playing their horns when they passed the cross, as a way of honoring the boy's memory. Years passed. Jake turned 50 years old, then 55. Sarah also aged gracefully. The cabin became a place known for the cross that marked the site of the accident. Cattlemen who passed looked at the cross. Some removed their hats in a sign of respect. The story had become part of local folklore. Jake continued keeping his vow. He never played the horn again. Sometimes, on lonely nights, he took the horn from its chest, held it in his hands, remembered. He remembered Tommy asking with those bright eyes for him to play it. He remembered the joy on the boy's face. He remembered that last day when Tommy died hearing a horn that wasn't his. And then he rapped the horn again and renewed his promise. 15 years after Tommy's death, when Jake was 60 years old, something changed. An old cattleman who had known Jake decades earlier passed through the gate. He recognized Jake despite the years and stopped to talk. During the conversation, the cattleman mentioned how much he missed hearing Jake's horn. "You were the best," he said. "Nobody played like you. Why did you stop playing?" Jake looked toward the cross on the road and told the complete story. The cattleman listened in silence. When Jake finished, the man put his hand on Jake's shoulder. "I understand your vow," he said. "But that boy loved the sound of your horn. He left this world hearing it. Maybe your silence doesn't honor him as much as you think. Maybe what he'd really want is for you to keep playing, to share that beauty he loved so much." Those words stayed with Jake. That night he couldn't sleep, thinking about them. He thought about Tommy, about how the boy had loved the sound. He thought about his vow, about the years of silence. And he wondered if his penance really honored Tommy or if it was just another way of punishing himself. One afternoon, almost 20 years after Tommy's death, Jake was sitting by the cross. He talked to Tommy as if the boy could hear him, telling him about his life, about Sarah. "Tommy," he finally said, "I've kept my horn all these years. I haven't played it since you left. I thought it was the right thing. But now I wonder if I was wrong. You loved that sound. It was what made you happiest. And I've silenced that sound out of guilt and sorrow. Is that really what you would have wanted?" There was no answer. Only the wind blowing softly. But in that silence, Jake felt something. It was as if a heavy burden was lifted from his shoulders. As if a soft voice told him it was okay, that Tommy wouldn't have wanted him to live in perpetual guilt. He returned to the cabin with a strange feeling in his chest. He went to his room and opened the chest where he kept the horn. He took it out, unwrapped the cloth. The instrument looked the same, perhaps a bit older, but essentially unchanged. He held it in his hands, feeling the familiar weight. He brought it to his lips and blew. The sound emerged hesitant at first, rusty from years of disuse. But then it became stronger, clearer. The deep and melancholic sound filled the air, traveling across the fields. Sarah, who was in the kitchen, heard the sound and stood motionless. She hadn't heard Jake play in almost 20 years. She ran out, tears in her eyes. She saw Jake standing on the porch, the horn at his lips, eyes closed, playing that melody that had been silent for so long. When Jake finished, he lowered the horn. He saw Sarah looking at him, tears running down her cheeks. They looked at each other for a long moment. "He heard it," Sarah said softly. "I'm sure Tommy heard it wherever he is. And I'm sure he's smiling." Jake nodded, unable to speak from emotion. He sat on the steps, holding the horn, feeling as if he'd crossed an important threshold. He hadn't really broken his vow. He'd evolved beyond it. He'd understood that honoring Tommy's memory didn't mean living in perpetual guilt, but remembering the joy the boy had brought to his life. The following years were calmer for Jake. He'd finally found peace. He played the horn occasionally, especially on significant dates. Tommy's birthday, the anniversary of his death. Each time he did, he felt he was connecting with the boy's spirit. The cross on the road remains to this day. It's been repaired many times over the years, but continues serving its function. Cattlemen who still travel those roads stop, remember the story. And many, as tribute, take out their horns and play. The deep sound fills the air, a tribute to a boy who loved that sound more than anything. Jake lived to 75 years old. They were good years. He never worked as a cattleman again, but found peace in his more sedentary life. Sarah lived to 70. She died peacefully one spring night. Jake buried her next to Tommy's grave. Jake survived Sarah by 3 years. He continued maintaining the cabin, continued caring for the cross, continued playing the horn occasionally. The town people looked after him. He was respected and loved. One autumn afternoon, Jake felt his time was approaching. He asked to be taken to the grave where Tommy and Sarah were buried. He wanted to say goodbye. He sat by the grave, leaning against the tree. The day was beautiful. For the last time, he took out his horn and brought it to his lips. He played with all the emotion of a life lived, of loves lost, of guilt released. He played a melody of farewell, of gratitude, of love. The sound traveled through the air, deep and melancholic. When he finished, he lowered the horn. He smiled softly, closing his eyes. And with that sound still resonating, with memories of Tommy filling his mind, Jake Morrison died in peace. He had finally learned that love, not guilt, is what truly honors those we've lost. They buried him next to Tommy and Sarah. The three now rested together. The cross on the road remains there. And when cattlemen pass, many play their horns. The sound fills the air, remembering that although Tommy left long ago, he has not been forgotten. The true value of a life isn't measured in years but in the love shared. Tommy lived only 10 years, but he forever changed those who knew him. He teaches us that every encounter matters, that we must value each moment with those we love, and that forgiveness toward ourselves is as important as forgiveness toward others. Guilt can imprison us, but love sets us free. Let us honor those we've lost not with eternal penance, but by living with the love and joy they taught us.